Although it may be some time before we see our students and faculty again here, we are working towards opening the Global Center next month. Ireland is now entering actually phase 3 of our 4-phased government approach for easing from COVID restrictions, which means hotels, restaurants, hairdressers, etc. will be able to reopen come June 29th. We hope that we can welcome traveling alumni, local Irish guests for retreats or creative escapes that we have planned, and other programming in the coming weeks in collaboration with our study abroad partner that we work with very closely here at the National University of Galway. Again, I want to reiterate my thanks for you joining us today to discuss Boccaccio's Decameron with Professor McCrea. We've heard great feedback from last week's session. It seems that everyone enjoyed meeting other participants in the breakout rooms and getting the opportunity to discuss their own experience. Don't worry, I've had a few texts or emails from people. If you've not finished the reading, today is about experiencing community and sharing our interpretation of living in COVID. So do not be stressed, as some of you conveyed to me, for not finishing this reading this afternoon. The book club community continues to grow even as we update our documents in this session. We have over 516 participants representing 18 countries from around the world. Barry and I are going to coerce some people from Australia or perhaps Antarctica to join us so that we can have all 7 continents represented. So it truly is a global discussion. We want to remind you at this time that we have a LinkedIn discussion board where you can connect with each other beyond your time with us this hour. So please feel to continue the conversation and discuss the topics on our LinkedIn discussion board. I'd like to take a moment now to just reiterate my thanks to all of our co-sponsors who have shared in the promotion of this book club. Notre Dame International, the Keough Institute for Irish Studies, the College of Arts and Letters, the Keough School of Global Affairs, Notre Dame Learning, and the Notre Dame Alumni Association. Together, we have put a dedicated and nimble team who really work hard behind the scenes to bring these sessions to you, these 4 weeks that we have. So similar to last week, we're going to use the chat function at the bottom of your screen for you to send in your comments and questions. We also ask that if you have questions for Barry, please use the Google form that you're sharing with, that we've shared with you already. This will allow us to facilitate the questions as effectively as possible. We will try and answer as many of them given the time constraint, but remember, if we don't get to all of them, we'll continue the discussion on LinkedIn. As you may know, when we promoted this event, we shared a few pre-recorded videos that are posted on ThinkND, where Barry provided a very good overview of the Decameron. For those of you who have not had the chance to watch them, I really recommend you to go back and do so, and they'll be there. I'd now like to welcome Barry to talk to us about our topic today, Boccaccio's Decameron. I have to say, Barry, in rereading the Decameron this past week, I feel compelled to remark at the onset of this session how hauntingly familiar the experience described in Boccaccio's introduction are similar to our own with COVID, especially about the description of how contagious the plague was and how often death occurred for some without any symptoms. Barry.
Hi, everybody. It's great to see you all again. I am enjoying the phased opening of Ireland. I'm particularly looking forward to the hairdressers opening. As you can see, I badly need it. So this is obviously a text from a very long time ago, 650 years ago. And I think I saw you nodding when Lisa referred to the uncanny familiarity of the descriptions of the plague. So we're talking about a world that is in almost all respects completely different from ours, but which nonetheless seems to be almost surreally similar. I was thinking about it, rereading it this time, that it's a text about survival in a way. The Black Death killed somewhere between a third and 2/3 of the inhabitants of Western Europe. So a lot of people didn't make it. And this is a text written just after the plague had finished by obviously somebody who survived. And I think the question of survival is key to it. It's the impulse behind it. And it's also the question that the text is thinking about. When you go through a strange experience, as we are too, there is a desire, I think, to record it, to record what it feels like. This might be one of the reasons that plague literature is some of the oldest literature we have. As we have records of plagues as long as we've had literature, but this is a particularly sophisticated version of it. Boccaccio takes the predicament of living through a plague and turns it into an exploration of the human world. One of the reasons for this might be that certain things about the human world, about human life, the mind, human society, become clear to us in a plague situation in a way that they don't in ordinary time when everybody is well, or at least when we're not all at risk of contagion. So in other words, it's built on this strange paradox that in a truly exceptional time, when everything is changed, we get to see normality in a heightened, in a clearer way. That a state of exceptionality makes normality somehow more visible. So the first part that you read for today is obviously completely different from the rest of it. We have 100 stories, and preceded by this introduction, which is a description of the plague. So this very gloomy introduction is the part that people are most struck by, because that is most similar to our own situation. There's a few things that are similar, as I said in the pre-recorded lectures. One is that there seem to be certain types of people that century after century persist in being those types of people. So the people who lock themselves away and eat healthy food and obsess about exercise, listen to classical music, that was one type. There's the people who go out carousing, drinking, enjoying themselves, ignoring all the public health advice. That's another group. And then there is the wealthy, lucky people who run away to their houses in the countryside. And Boccaccio stresses that even though, as is the case today, the poor suffer more than the rich do in a plague, the rich are convinced that their wealth is going to save them, and they're not always right. So the plague also arrives in these country houses. So what we have in the first part of this text is a sense of what is lost in lockdown. Social roles, a sense of the future, a sense of identity, a sense of togetherness. And what we have then is a plan cooked up by young people who are suffering in this plague, who are suffering from all those types of loss, a plan to compensate for it, a plan for psychic survival. And once that starts, once the plan for it is kicked in, which the plan is to all go together to a country house and tell each other stories, to draw down, in other words, on what they already have on their minds. And once that plan starts, we are in a whole new narrative realm. And it's something I'm going to ask you to think about in your breakout groups. So what are the losses that the young people experience that they have to compensate for? Some of these we talked about last week. A loss of the sense of future, loss of the possibility of traveling, a loss of being able to be together, close to other people in an unproblematic way. What are their solutions? First of all, because they can't travel in the body, they decide to travel in the mind by transporting each other to other worlds, realms, situations. They cannot be fully together in body, so they come together in mind. Instead of turning their minds towards the future, which is closed off to them, they turn their minds inward. They draw down on what they have already. The very first story, the one I asked you to read, it's the first of 100 stories, and they're all different. But this very first story seems to be, at first reading, just a relief, a change from the gloomy description of the plague. Excuse me. But if we look at this story closely, we can see that the themes of the plague and the losses that are experienced by people who lived through a pandemic are actually woven into the fabric of the story itself. The opening gloomy description of the plague describes people, as I said, in terms of types. So people are no longer complex individuals, but really just sorted into kind of big blocks of instinctive reactions and impulses, almost like animals. People who stay at home, people who go out, people who go to their houses. And we also have a suspicion of the appetites of the bodies. As you'll have noticed, there's quite an emphasis on lack of modesty and sexual licentiousness during the plague, and the first one kind of worries about that. And then also we have these quite horrifying descriptions of the difficulties of disposing of corpses and the absence of real funeral rites. In this story, we have the appetites of the body restored to being enjoyable. They are sinful, but also enjoyable things. We have hunger, greed, lust. We also have a funny version of the question of how bodies are disposed of. And especially, and this is my main thought, especially we have somebody who is such a strange and unusual and complex individual that he cannot be reduced to a type. So after the pandemic, which turns people into statistics, into aggregations, into types, into kind of collective, undifferentiated masses, we have this celebration of individual strangeness. We have an individual who is unclassifiable. He controls his own reputation. He means different things to different people. So that's the story of Ceperello. And I think we can see in it too the story of survival, what it is to come through a plague and what it is to come out the other side when other people didn't. And I think this is the last piece I'm going to say. This is connected to the whole question of Ceperello's identity, to his posthumous reputation, to the way he's able to control that and change that. So we have a sense that people after a plague are not the same as they were before. So we see this, that a survivor is not the same person that they were coming into the plague. Okay, that's my little run through the reading. We're now going to ask you, or we're going to separate you into breakout groups to discuss 3 questions that I'll give to you in a moment. Just a few reminders about the breakout rooms. First of all, you don't have to go. If you really don't want to, you can just go back to the main room, stay there, and wait for it to be over, and everybody will come back. So you don't have to go if you don't want to. Second of all, please be nice and civil to each other in these rooms. Listen to each other as well as talking to each other. And this is what I'd like to happen once you're in the rooms. First of all, I'd like you to introduce yourselves to one another. You can say who you are, maybe where you are, and some other detail if you want to share it. And then I'd like you to be like the young people in the Decameron and pick a king or queen for the day. Whatever way you do that is up to you, but you'll have to elect your king or queen. You have to run out into the garden and make a quick laurel crown and bring it back in. No, you don't have to do that, but you'd have to pick a king or queen who's going to be the one to report your questions. And then I would like you to think about the following 3 questions, and that's going to come up on your screen now. So think through Boccaccio's description of the plague that opens the reading for today, and pick one detail as specific as possible that corresponds to some experience you've had during our own outbreak. So one specific detail that rings true to your experience now, 650 years later. Second of all, I'd like you to think back, those who've done the reading, and if you haven't done the reading, as Lisa said, that's fine. But if those who have done the reading, think back to it. And remember how you felt when you got to the end of the description of the plague and moved into the first story. Finally, I'd like you to think back to the plan that the young people cook up to protect themselves, to go out to the country house and engage in this kind of elaborate game of storytelling. Think back to that and consider if there's anything about their plan that is or might be helpful to you in your own managing of your psychological experience of our current pandemic. Okay, see you when you come back from the rooms.
Welcome back, everyone. I hope you found your group as enlightening as I did mine, and I hope that you submit the questions or comments that you'd like in the form or in the chat room device, which will link us to the questions. So I'm going to start off with my own question, selfishly, Barry, that I have. And I will then feed into the ones that come in as we're talking. And thank you for those who've submitted in advance too. We'll get to those as well. But I want to talk a bit about like the whole idea of funerals and burial customs, because they seem to have in Ireland at least, it was a dramatic impact on not being able to celebrate the funerals. And I mean, our own family had a death in our family, and to not go there because you could physically contaminate, and it was a psychologically, it was very difficult I think for Irish people, because especially for Irish people, death is so profound, and we come together as a community and we share. And what I noticed from the introduction, how similar funerals in Italy were in the 14th century as they are today, such a collective occasion to share in the grief and to mitigate your sadness, and it's a very intimate setting that it happens in, from the home, similar to Ireland. So I was wondering if you can comment perhaps on that correlation between an Ireland or an Irish and an Italian perspective, and how it's been profoundly disrupted by COVID, this inability to mitigate our grief.
You know, it's a great question, Lisa. And like, when you were talking, I was just thinking that this comes up again and again and again in testimony of traumatic events. So you think the Irish famine, one of the things that was most traumatizing in accounts of the famine was the inability to dispose of the dead in a dignified way. It's one of the things that the famine survivors think they couldn't talk about. And I remember a few years ago, I met a Holocaust survivor on the island of Rhodes in Greece, which had been an Italian colony during the war. And just randomly met this woman who had been in Auschwitz. And she spoke fluent Italian, completely fluent Italian, like almost, like an Italian person. And she was telling us her experience of being in Auschwitz. And so she had this very sophisticated Italian. She knew all of these complicated words. And the one word she couldn't remember was funerals. She said, what is that thing you do when somebody dies and you put them in a box and you carry them around? And I could see there was obviously a very profound psychological effect, even after all these years, that, she had this obvious psychological block about the word. And it comes up quite often in Holocaust testimonies or survival accounts, and in the famine too. And there's something in it, I think, it's connected to how the pandemic risks flattening everything and turning us all into the same thing, just into types, and our bodies just into sort of big kind of bags of biological matter, to be protected. And I think one of the great things about the Decameron is in the way in which they respond to that and counteract that and restore dignity and excitement and individuality, and especially pleasure to the body, that bodies become very particular and individual, and especially attractive things. That's one of the things that happens in the move from the introduction to the stories, is the restoration of dignity and excitement and even magic to the individual human body.
So it seems that this was a topic that a few people submitted questions on, Barry. So I'm going to go to Jane Wegman's question. She writes, I'm wondering about how ritual and a sense of time tied to religion, sacrament, interact with the changed sense of time caused by the plague, which is oriented towards the present. Do you, Barry, have any thoughts on the significance of the young people finding one another and devising their time at Mass? or about the way in which Ciparello achieves a lasting reputation as a saint through his storytelling in the sacrament of confession.
Well, there's one piece of that that I want to talk about because it came up in the group I was in with Michelle and Trudy earlier in the breakout, which is about time and the structure of time. But one of the things that I think we've all noticed is that during the pandemic, our time starts to lose structure. Our days start to feel all the same. They go very quickly, everybody seems to say. And this does have strange effects on our minds and on our sense of ourselves. And Michelle in our group was saying that putting a structure on your day is a very important part of psychic survival. And that's one of the things they do. And I think that's one of the reasons why, one of the many reasons why they lament the decline of religious institutions in the opening part, that there aren't enough friars, they don't have funerals, that things can't, because obviously it's one of the ways of marking the passage of time during the year, but also just during the individual day. That's, again, it's another of the things that they manage to recreate when they go off to their beautiful house on the hill, is that this very strict and regimented, but also very pleasurable routine that every day follows. Almost replacing religion in a way in liturgy. You know, there is an almost liturgical quality to their ceremony, if you like. You know, there's kind of readings and singing, and so this kind of lost sense of ritual and structure is they find a way to replicate it, to recreate it.
I found it very interesting that they imposed order relatively quickly too. Right away. Yeah. It was, even though the social order had fallen away as soon as they arrived in their first villa, the construct of social order was immediately implemented by the election of the leader in Pampinea, who I thought was interesting, that given what the introduction had to say about females and their reliance on the males being in situ to give them order and sane head, that they have a female lead as their first queen of the environment. And she, as a leader, actually quite effectively instigates a routine and a schedule that is quite impressive for a young woman, I would say, but also for the community to adhere to this set of rules that she implements fairly efficiently. I wonder if you can comment to the kind of social construct that these 7 young women and 3 men create in the villa.
Well, you're right. It's the first thing they do. As you sort of think when they leave, you know, plague-ridden Florence, maybe they would just say, let's all just hang out. Everybody do what you want. You know, there's no rules here. But in fact, in order to relax, they need the opposite. To actually wind down, what they need to do is impose, as you say, Lisa, this quite elaborate structure on their time, on their identities, to structure things. And you can see it's sort of a microcosmic version of something that has to happen in a macrocosm, you know, on the social and political and indeed economic level after a plague, is to recreate structures that we can live in, that we can share the world with each other through. That's what I think. I think the line about, oh, we need the man, or, you know, it won't work, there's some irony in that, because as you say, she actually thinks it all up. It's all her idea. She's the creative genius behind it. She picks everything. There's one of the men who's funny, so that he has that talent, but otherwise you just they're kind of there and go, God, we need a few men, sort of for the look of it, right? So
do you think the gender breakdown and the selection is deliberate? Because it seems that it is, though, that he's just
well, the other thing they say is that well, of course, one of them fancies one of the men, but like, oh, but of course we'll never do anything because we're much too virtuous. And there's also some joking around with that, I think. You know, I'm going to take this handsome man that I think is so attractive and lock myself away in a villa with him for 10 days. But of course, I'm much too virtuous to, you know, for anything. So I think there's some playing around with that as well. That the real reason they want the men is because they find their bodies and their company pleasurable. And we're moving from a world where other people's bodies are potential sources of contagion, things to be avoided, to be fled, things that are diseased or contagious. And we actually then they turn it to we want these handsome lads around because you know, they're enjoyable to look at and listen to. They make us laugh. They fill us with desire.
I have another question. This is from Susan Omar. Barry, in the preface of the book, the narrator talks about the differences between men and women who are in love, arguing that men have lots of outlets for their energies and that women are pent up with within the narrow confines of their rooms and dwell on their thoughts. He suggests that we want to offer support for his women readers in particular. Could you tell us some more about how Boccaccio imagined his readers and how his view of his readers compares with attitudes of other writers in Florence at the time?
Well, it's a very interesting question, you know. You know, in certain ways, he's such a realist, and there's more. I would say the writer I would think of comparing him to is Dante, another Florentine at the time, where you know there are lots of different types of women in Dante, but there is especially a form of idealized femininity, this kind of pure ethereal sense, you know, kind of a source of absolute goodness. Whereas the women in Boccaccio are, I mean, that's only part of Dante. It's not, I wouldn't want to characterize all of them like that. But I suppose more interesting is that the women in Boccaccio are they're very forthright about their desires. So what we usually have in courtly literature, you know, the literature about knights and ladies, and is the woman being an object of desire and the man being the one who desires. But in Boccaccio, women have very robust desires and they're not afraid to express them. And I think that's some of the great energy that the stories have is originate in female desire. It's one of the fantastic things about the book, I think.
This might be a tough question. This is from Fritz Heisen. Do you have a rough idea as to the percentage of men and to women who were literate at the time? No, given that he knows that Florence was a very educated city at the time, you would expect it to be an above average number of people who would be able to read the Boccaccio's Decameron.
Yes, I don't know in truth. I think literacy was mostly a class issue, more than as far as I know, more than a gender issue. But I'm not certain. No, I need a historian for that. Though, I mean, these stories were designed to be also read aloud, obviously, as the thing suggests. But but there was plenty literacy, at least in the upper classes, as far as I know.
We're going to switch it a bit to theme to nature, and as we witness, I guess, the impact of our withdrawal from society, I suppose, and there's been dramatic impact upon nature, and you see this as a sort of restoring of balance. We hear of news stories of foxes entering residential neighborhoods in Dublin or goats in urban settings in Scotland. How does Boccaccio interpret the plague's impact upon nature, would you say?
Well, I think he's very troubled, or at least the book is very troubled by the blurring of the boundaries between the human world and the natural world. And we might have a different take on that in ways, I think, but I do see it in COVID, the experience of COVID-19 as well, that there's something about the fact that a disease, because it is a biological phenomenon, it does in ways reduce us in some aspects to our bare animal beings, that we are not even just animals, but just that we are part of the natural world, that we pass on this thing to one another without knowing it, without having any conscious control of it. And I think he's on the one hand, it's a reminder that we are part of nature, a very important reminder that we are part of nature, that human beings are not the opposite of nature, but part of it. On the other hand, it's in Boccaccio, he thinks about also the troubling aspects of that, that there's something that animal appetites can take over, and that civility in all its senses, it's a word that's connected to the city, to citizenship, that civility is put under pressure, under erasure by the kind of regression to an animal state. So I think it goes in two different complicated ways, that it's an important reminder of the fact that we're part of nature, the ecology of the world, of the universe, but also that we need to, part of being civilized is to keep a check on our animal impulses, to keep them in check, to repress them in ways to counteract them.
I'm also recalling that he had a little vignette of pigs in the beginning of the introduction, of interfering with the material. So he does see that there's the similar sort of wildness of animals in the city. We're going to move a bit to the I suppose the friar and the confessor episode. In the first story, it is the piety or lack of worldly familiarity of the friar confessor that makes him believe Ciparello's lies. The friar, by virtue of his role as a highly regarded figure, is taken by the community as an authority whose version of the truth should be believed. Yet because of his gullibility and lack of due diligence in questioning Ciparello and getting any substantiation for his claims, he misleads everyone, including the community, who eventually venerates him. What does this say about the responsibility of authority figures for communicating accurate information to their constituents?
Well, scholars have discussed this a lot and gone back and forth about what this means. And there is the basic question of, to what extent is the Decameron an anti-clerical story, and to what, because Boccaccio became a priest, so it can't be entirely anti-clerical. On the other hand, we seem there that there's obviously some mockery going on, there's some irony. So I think I would say that the answer to that question is in the question, that he's very provocatively posing that question and making us wonder whose authority is to be believed. Also, is it who's to know? He says he's not even sure that Ciparello goes to hell. He's like, well, he might be, and I presume he's in hell, but I don't really know. That he escapes again all attempts to define him or predict him or know. And in the end, I think it's a celebration of the unknowability of the mind of the other. The other people's minds are just radically unknowable to us. And it's a really anti-plague idea. We're not just biological entities. We're not just types. We are these completely unknowable mental universes, each individual. That's what I get from it.
Well, that's a profound revelation that we found you imparted to us in our little group, because it's such a preposterous thing to be so cheeky, we would think, on your deathbed, that this is one of the last sacraments that you would be compelled to be honest. So it's a very discomforting read to experience that, but you've kind of turned it on its head for us in thinking it's a sort of freedom. I have another question from Eileen Durkin, and it is, do you know of any examples of times through the centuries where other societies have turned to the Decameron during public health crisis?
Oh gosh, I'm trying to think, did they talk about the Decameron in 1918, 19? They did. That's right. I read an article in an Italian newspaper about it, that people did look back to it. They did. And also to Defoe's Journal of the Plague Year, which is one we're not reading here, but it's a very detailed account of the Black Death in London. They also look back, people read back to that one.
So I have another question with regards to the Canterbury Tales, and do you compare the Decameron, or can you compare the Decameron with the Canterbury Tales? The latter is more scabrous and engaging. Decameron sounds so utterly bourgeois and tame.
Well, I beg to differ, is my first response. So I mean, I can see where the question is coming from. The Canterbury Tales are explicitly modeled on the Decameron. So Chaucer read it and wanted to imitate it. And I suppose coming later, he was, yeah, and also coming from a different place, he was, able to do different things with it. I see what the question means, that there's something about the earlier part of the Decameron where it seems a little bit wooden and formulaic, and it's closer maybe to older traditional literary forms, and that there's something that feels kind of modern and fresh about Canterbury Tales. But if you read the rest of the 99 stories in the Decameron, they are anything but tame and bourgeois. So we have all social classes, and some of them are kind of too scandalous even to. I wouldn't mention them on Zoom. What happens in them? They are very. They're certainly won't be disappointed if that's what you're looking for. But there is definitely a relationship between the two, a very close one, and I see what the questioner means, but no, there's plenty scabrous stuff in the Decameron if you keep reading. I read one a night. That's what I've been doing, because they're short enough to just read one before you go to sleep. That's how I've got to it.
I'm going to turn it to Irish literature in comparison now, from Catherine Wilsden in Dublin. The elevation of Capriello to the position of saint by the local community has certain parallels with Synge's Playboy of the Western world. What Boccaccio and Synge's communities have in common is a state of paralysis. Do you think this state of paralysis is fertile ground for saint hero making? Is there something in the fact that both hero saint figures emerge from ordinary life and not from great military feats or royal lineage?
Wow, what an interesting comparison. I would never have thought of it in a million years. I suppose, isn't this something to do with survival, and not just in the purely biological sense, but that the pandemics or they paralyze everything, as Catherine says, and that means that they also, I'm mixing metaphors now, they paralyze everything and therefore shake everything up. So who's in charge, or what ideologies are reigning at the end of a pandemic are often not the ones that were there before. And in that sense, they create a kind of a vacuum for certain types of leaders to emerge. And these sort of saint-like charismatic figures who emerge from the people at times of crisis, they can be great and helpful and bring back some hope to society, but they can also, as we know, be terrifying. And one of the things I don't want to be what they call a Debbie Downer, but after the last big plague we had, which is the Spanish influenza, we did see the rise of fascism and the cult of the populist leader Mussolini, Hitler. I mean, that what was one of the consequences, I think, of the Spanish flu, was that we had these a kind of a desire for charismatic individual leaders, that it can easily go wrong. Now I'm straying away from Irish literature into kind of Italian and German political history, but I think it's connected to Catherine's question. This that regimes often change during these types of events, whether for the better or the worse, we don't know.
I think it's an interesting comparison to use Synge's character and the way the town rallies around this pseudo leader, because they find him interesting.
Yeah, it's a great question, actually. I wish I'd.
Okay, you mentioned the movie, so there's a couple questions that follow up for the movie. The tone of the movie, the Decameron, is so much different from the book. The movie almost seems like a farce. Can you comment upon the movie and its impact?
No, yes, I see what they mean. Although that's, I think, in part because Pasolini took out the plague part of it. So we just have the stories, which and there are many farcical aspects to the stories. There's a kind of real slapstick element to the stories, which Pasolini was drawn to. So he turns up the volume on that aspect of the Decameron at the expense of other ones. But I think that in Pasolini's mind, and I see Valentina Jadi is here, and I just see on the, somebody who knows about Pasolini. We talked about him together before. On Pasolini's mind, the equivalent of the plague was what he thought of as the suffocating conformist culture of early and mid 20th century Italy, fascist Italy, and extremely church-ruled Italy. So that, in his mind, what is the plague for Boccaccio is this extreme conformity. And so for him, making this film at the end of the 60s with the kind of sexual revolution, it was a way of celebrating some of those things that are like what Boccaccio is celebrating, just in a different context. So I think we have to read that film in its own time, the 1960s, but also see that there's a connection between what the two people are trying to do, Boccaccio and Pasolini. He thought there's a joy also in slapstick and in the life of ordinary people that is really characteristic of all Pasolini's films.
I'm going to end with this question because there's been a few of them that came through the discussion board and in the chats about like the ending of the Decameron, and I hope it might be a spoiler for some of you who have not gotten to the end of it. But again, in relation to the movie, this Kathy Schwab asked that she has watched it, and it said it seemed very erotic. Are most of the other 99 stories like the movie? Did people in Italy really behave that way after the plague? I guess I did not see that happening so much here during our own pandemic. But we did feel questions of like what happens in the rest. So perhaps you can give us this is spoiler alert, but can give us a sense.
But it's something that comes up in other plague situations. It was part of the folklore in Ireland around tuberculosis was that patients who had severe tuberculosis would suddenly give themselves over to licentiousness. This was it was considered a kind of a moral hazard, and people should stay away from people who were very ill with tuberculosis because they were, kind of mad with physical desire. And there was, so it's a common, and it comes up also in Defoe's Journal of the Plague Year. And I suppose it must be to do with that when faced with death, there is a desire to celebrate the opposite of it. Its opposite, which is, life and desire. And in a way, that is part of the fundamental structure of the Decameron, actually. That the whole thing is actually built in that way. Because yes, spoiler alert, the stories are full of that all the way through. It's unashamedly interested in it, and so that's what Pasolini loved about it, of course. One of the things.
Well, we've definitely, in our own environment, seen the polarities of it with our own, like from young people managing through TikTok and social media, and others retreating from society completely, or cocooning, as the nuns have here. I want to thank you, Barry, for again an enlightened and engaging. I really enjoyed today's discussion, and I want to thank each and every one of the participants that took their time out of their days to join us. I know it's short, but it's good. So I'd like you to continue the conversation with us on our discussion board. Don't feel like we're abandoning you. We can discuss current topics and more political topics if you wish, or the rest of the book if you'd like, on the LinkedIn discussion board. So next week, it's a movie. It's Alfred Hitchcock's great classic, The Rear Window, starring Grace Kelly and James Stewart. So there'll be, in addition, there'll be part 3, which is now on ThinkND, which is Barry's lecture and shorter explainer videos that are cut into his lecture. So I encourage you to review the lecture and come prepared, but also to indulge and go back and watch The Rear Window, a really treat for us to do so. This is also not, please encourage yourself to share with your friends the series that we have going on. We have 2 more, and ThinkLD will be accepting registrations throughout the entire program, as each meeting that when we meet is a standalone. So they can drop in for next week and the week after with no worry. So once again, Barry, thanks so much.
My pleasure.
And thanks to you all. It was good to see your faces, and we look forward to seeing you next week.